All right, students, welcome to 29.2.3, and we are still in our civil rights part of the lesson here. Today we are going to be talking about a few other groups that needed additional civil rights protections and improvements to their position as to where they were at in society. So we're going to talk about a couple different groups today. It's about three of them that we're really going to focus in on. And this is not a super long section, so we'll kind of go through it fairly quickly today, all right? Okay, let's start off. Okay, so our very first group that we're looking at here is Lyndon Johnson really wanted to tackle the issues of poverty. And so he wanted to see if he could elevate the impoverished American to a higher level or a higher place in society, an improvement to their position. And now we're not just talking about one particular subset of people. There's multiple ones that he tries to tackle. We'll go over that here, though, in a minute. But what brings this to light to the American populace is a 1962 book by Michael Harrington called The Other America. So Harrington really covers the impoverished sections of America. He covers those workers who are not making living wages. He focuses on those who are in the greatest need. And he really starts to push societal ideas and pushes for change. Now, again, as a historical note, I make sure that I kind of explain people to. Again, you need to understand people's worldviews to see where they're coming from. Michael Harrington, if you were to look him up, he was a pretty ardent socialist, even bordering on the line of communist. Often socialists believe in expanding social welfare benefits. So they typically have an agenda when they're pushing forward certain ideas. So with a socialist like Harrington, he would be pushing for reform in government and state intervention into assisting the poor and needy. So you need to know that people do have biases when they present ideas. The reason why I bring this up is because if you do research him again, though, you're going to find a lot of his other writings that are really centric on socialist thought processes, okay? So his viewpoint, of course, is that the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, and so he suggested that there needs to be improvement for care such as the elderly, poor whites, and African Americans. And this is a pretty big idea that LBJ latches onto, and that's what I was starting to get into before I bring him up, is that he looks at, he even goes out to like poor West Virginia farmers and takes pictures with them and finds out how they're living. So he's looking at not only helping like disadvantaged and poor African American communities, he starts looking at rural white communities too. And then another thing that really gets tackled here is the issue of how to care for the elderly. Unfortunately, oftentimes what was happening is that the elderly were finding themselves without access to proper medical care. Medical care was getting more expensive, so they started to try to find solutions on how to care better for the elderly and not leave them in such an impoverished state too. So Harrington really points out to some of these disadvantages that these people suffered from and thinks of ideas and how to try to solve them. And so does LBJ. And so one of the first things that he looks at of how to improve, of course, is educational opportunities. So he looks at improving education, access to education, and improvement to education. He really wants to elevate like the inner city schools, bring in better teachers, make sure that every kid has a chance at a proper and good education in order to lift them out of an impoverished situation. Another thing that he does during his administration is raise the minimum wage to try to help improve low-income wage earners areas so that they can make a little bit more money to try to lift themselves up. One of the big parts of LBJ's platform is he creates what's called the Great Society. He sees, as America being greater than it was at the time, or at least as he saw it. And so he really ramps up social welfare programs. You start seeing expansion of Medicaid, Medicare. You see the growth of Social Security benefits. You see food stamps programs increase, welfare benefits increase. You see this very large growth of the federal government during this time frame. In fact, when you look at it, and I have it down here, but you see before LBJ was in office, we were at about 45 social welfare programs. By the time he leaves, there's over 435. In order to administer this type of these types of programs, you do have to then have an enlarged federal government workforce. And so this is where you see a very rapid expansion of the United States federal government. Other things, though, that they do is they look at inner city America. They look to try to improve housing. Then they build low-income housing blocks for people to live in. If you look at modern society now, what seemed like a good idea then has now turned into a lot of these inner city low-income housing areas have become kind of havens of crime. And so while the idea was great, it was not well implemented in this historian's view anyways, because it gave birth to a large-scale gang activity. And it's something that really started to plague the inner cities in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. It's still a problem today, but it really came to a head in the 80s and into the 90s, where you saw this rapid increase in crime and criminal activity in those low-income housing areas. Sorry, that was a tangent, but it's I also enjoy studying sociology and society and how groups develop, and so I sometimes go on my tangent. Eventually, though, with this expansion of federal programs, it starts to eat into the federal budget to the tune of about 40%, and it's still increasing and rapidly growing every year. Another group that they looked at to help were people with mental and physical disabilities during this time frame. Unfortunately, people who had like Down syndrome or suffered from other mental ailments were often locked away in state mental hospitals. They were not given very many opportunities in life to improve their situation or their station. And so this really is something that people start advocating for, is seeing that these people are not like a danger to themselves and that they do have the ability to be semi-independent. We're not, there's no saying that these people, we would want to be able just to leave them out on their own and try to make their own way. They do still need some supervision, but they do have the ability to have more of a life than sitting in a mental hospital their whole life. Also, blind and deaf students were sent to segregated schools and often were not given job building skill sets in order to improve themselves. That has changed in modern society. We have the tools and the resources now that really a blind individual or even a deaf individual has the ability to be successful in a career now. But before, they were not granted that opportunity. And so instead of locking them away and segregating them into hospitals and specialized schools, people started to push for them to have a more integrated role into society and pull them out from kind of the dark corners of it and give them opportunity. Also, we start passing laws that we now have to have ramps so people in wheelchairs can get into buildings, put elevators into buildings, give them access to parking spots, and improve mass transit. So anything that received federal dollars at one point required that they had to be handicapped accessible. That's why you now see wheelchair ramps on pretty much every bus that you go to, and why mass transit is probably one of the easiest way for somebody who may have a physical disability to get around, because the federal government has mandated that those be accessible for those people. Excuse me. All right. So there's a couple different laws here that are passed, of course, like the Urban Mass Transit. That's what we just talked about. You have your Rehabilitation Acts, your Elementary and Secondary Education Acts. That's where you get a lot of help for students or individuals that might have some learning disabilities, so they can get proper help and have modifications made in order to assist them to ensure that they can be successful in school. And then you also have Education for All handicapped children. That also helps and improves it too. All right, immigration. We do change up our immigration system a little bit. Remember when we were talking about Cesar Chavez, how there was a large amount of openness for immigration from Mexico. This changes with underneath during these reforms. And the other thing was those too is that a lot of times immigration quotas favored people in of European descent and in Europe itself. Instead, what happens is the United States does not allow, when we say 20,000 people, it doesn't mean every country gets that much. But we now have an allotment where we allow up to 20,000 people from each country to come in instead of specific countries in general. And so it goes into a first come, first serve basis. And really you start to see people coming from like Asia. You start to see people coming from Africa. And you see people coming over from a litany of other places that historically had not had access to the United States. But you really do see the largest increase in the Asian American community that is allowed into here. And this is, while this is a good idea, at the same time, it has also bogged down our immigration system. So if you talk to anybody who's had to go through it before, they will tell you it's still incredibly difficult to get into the United States. And lastly, let's talk about refugees. So America starts to open up its borders more to help out people who are victims of political discrimination, oppression, religious discrimination, oppression, anything that could be politically or hazardous to their well-being. They could apply for as a refugee to the United States. And if we determine that they have standing, we would allow them to come over here. And the biggest number of these that have historically been granted were the Cubans. First off, after Castro's regime fell, the United States had a policy of, if you can escape Cuba and you can land on the coast and put your feet on the sand, you are now a refugee and the United States will protect you. With the fall of Saigon, a large number of South Vietnamese came to the United States because if they would have stayed over there, it's a good chance they would have been killed by the new communist government in place. One of the things, though, that happens with the increase in immigrants and refugees is you start to see very ethnic neighborhoods start to form up, built around those refugee groups. Like especially down in Florida, there's definitely very Cuban neighborhoods. All right, guys, that ends this unit right here. Go ahead, make sure you do the quiz and the assignment, and I will see you again tomorrow.